Order. Thank you. We'd like to acknowledge Commissioner McDonald, who's joining us by phone today. I'm going to call for a motion and second for approval of the meeting minutes of the regular commission meeting of March 14th, 2018.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We'll ask Curtis for the executive director's report and his remarks.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to draw your attention again to our safety champions, four great port folks up here who've really been leading the way for us in terms of safety as an organization. Stan, I wonder if you would share a safety moment with us this morning.
Certainly. My message today is going to be on distracted driving. And according to the Portland Bureau of Transportation, 45 people were killed on city streets in Portland in 2017, making it the deadliest year since 2003, when 47 people were killed. In fact, an uptick in deaths began around 2010, and overall deaths have gone up each year since 2012. And while a lot of focus is put on how many people die, let us not forget how many people suffered incapacitating injuries on a Portland street this last year. The 2017 data on this next item is not available yet, but 275 people suffered a serious traffic-related injury in 2016. Each death and serious injury obviously represents an indescribable loss suffered by that individual, family, friends, and our community. There's also been a big increase in pedestrian fatalities in Portland, whose deaths jumped from 13 in 2016 to 18 in 2017. And just in a 2-week period in March, I don't know if you were reading the papers, but it really struck me. There were 5 pedestrian fatalities in 2 weeks, bringing the total up to 9 people, 6 pedestrians and 3 motorists killed on Portland streets so far in 2018. You know, there's a variety of factors that contribute to these accidents: speed, weather conditions, the street design, infrastructure. But there's no doubt that distracted driving is a dangerous behavior that continues to put drivers, passengers, and non-occupants at risk. Statistics from ODOT, or the Oregon Department of Transportation, show that in Oregon, a distracted driver causes a crash every 2.5 hours. That's almost 10 crashes each day. Distracted driving causes 1 in every 12 serious injury accidents in Oregon. So April is National Distracted Driving Awareness Month, as a reminder to everyone about the dangers of distracted driving. Distracted driving is any activity that could divert a person's attention away from the primary task of driving. Even hands-free is not risk-free, as dangerous mental distractions while engaged in a phone call exist even when you have your hands on the wheel and your eyes on the road. The fight to end distracted driving starts with each of us, and just like buckling up, it's a decision that will save lives. This April, I ask that people make the commitment to protect lives by never texting or talking on the phone while driving, be a good passenger and speak out if the driver is distracted, and encourage friends and family to drive phone-free. That's my message today, Curtis.
Great. Thank you, Stan. I'm sure everyone else sees it, but I just see this great proliferation of devices in people's hands and talking on the phone, and it is obviously having some pretty severe impacts. Thank you very much. Last month, Bobby reported out about the opening of the quick turnaround facility here on airport property, and I've got a rather lengthy update for all of you about the projects in PDX Next. The QTA is complete and open, and we're working out a few of the smaller kinks, but we've been very pleased with the opening so far. Elsewhere in the PDX Next program, terminal balancing, you I'm sure have seen, is also out of the ground. Final contract drawings for the Concourse E extension are complete and have been issued to Skanska for construction, and that completes the long-awaited redesign of Concourse E. Small business participation for construction is trending around 20%, which is our goal for the project. And construction has started on the foundation and utility tunnel, with pile driving underway, I believe, already. We've certainly watched some of those pilings go into the ground. The parking additions and car rental facility, which will be right next to us here, we've received our National Environmental Policy Act documentation from FAA and have submitted the first round of documentation essentially around proposed construction. It's for construction on airport property either above 200 feet or in the line of sight of the tower. It's a huge process, and real kudos go out to Port staff and Marla Harrison in particular and her team for really getting us on this critical path. The exterior design work for the rental car center, which will be the sort of the occupied portion of that building, continues to progress, and we're hoping by the end of this month to have that design work ready. T-Core, the big one, the big kahuna, proposed ZGF design amendment for Concourse B is coming to commission today. I'm sure we'll have a good conversation about that. And our contract negotiations for our contract manager, general contractor, Skanska Hoffman, are proceeding, hopefully ready for your review in next month's commission meeting. On the marine side of our business, they say they build ships to be one of a kind, but many ships have ruled the sea. We're welcoming one that will help rule the sea in the future. It's the USS Portland, arriving this weekend at Terminal 2. We are hosting on Saturday, April 21st, the commissioning of that naval vessel, and it's actually the first USS Portland, although it's the third USS Portland. Vince, I hope I'm right here. It's the first to be named specifically after Portland, Oregon, as opposed to our friendly Portland on the East Coast. And it is expected to be in service for 40 years. On air service development, a few pieces of news. I missed our last commission meeting in March because several of us went to celebrate with Delta and KLM the 10-year anniversary of the Amsterdam flight. We had a great meeting with the KLM team and then dinner with KLM CEO. And I'll just say it's an extraordinary relationship. It's for those of you who've seen it up close and personal, they really, really like us. I feel like I'm Sally Field. They are great partners. They've been terrific, and they really appreciate the fact that we engage with them on a regular basis. On April 23rd, the port will be leading a delegation to Mexico City to celebrate the Mexico City flight and promote further business and travel opportunities between the Portland region and Mexico. We're very excited about that. And finally, happy to note that Delta relaunches the PDX London Heathrow flight on May 4th. That'll be, again, 4 times a week and has provided just a great connection to London. A few bits of news to wrap up. April 29th kicks off National Small Business Week. And the focus, of course, is near and dear to us at the port. Since 1995, more than 100 small businesses have participated in our Mentor Protege program, which, as you know, is a national model for other agencies, including the Small Business Administration and the National Associated General Contractors. On March 31st, port employees volunteered in the community with Friends of Trees, planting in the Beaumont, Wilshire, Cully, and Roseway neighborhoods. And since 2010, our planted tree count is over 7,000 trees planted by port employees. I am participating and continue to participate in the ODOT Value Pricing Task Force. That's addressing from the 2017 transportation package out of the legislature congestion pricing. I'll just say we quite broadly are encouraged by the conversation about pricing on highways in the metropolitan region, some real issues to deal with on impacts of communities, of especially lower income residents. But I'm hopeful that that conversation will lead us to an actual process to price essentially the high traffic times and help reduce traffic congestion in the Portland area, especially for freight as it pertains to the port, but more broadly for the whole community. I'll just say that we have been advocates for that kind of approach, a very strong economic driver there to help minimize unnecessary travel in those peak travel times. And then finally, Hillsborough Airport Master Plan update. We're still in the midst of that process, a 2-year process. We're coming up on halfway through. In the last month, we hosted a Spanish-speaking open house in Cornelius and hosted the final of 3 Spanish-speaking tours of Hillsborough Airport. in partnership with Centro Cultural, and
Welcome to the teleconference service.
Come-
Please enter your access code, followed by the pound sign.
and then finally, the English-speaking open house in Hillsborough on March 22nd drew more than 80 people.
There are participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands.
Thank you. Just a call for a motion and second for approval of the executive director's report.
I so move. Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. I'll ask now if anyone has a public comment to make. Okay, seeing none. Kristen, if you could introduce our
You
first general
bet.
discussion.
What I'm going to do is stay here while Scott and Josh take the seats up front and introduce this item. So historically, what we've done as we're heading into the budget season is a bit of an economic kind of environment background, thinking about not just the budget at the port, but the world that we sit in and how that can affect the economics of what we're dealing with. And so I want to let Scott introduce our guest, but we thought it'd be interesting to have someone come and really present as this information is presented to a lot of elected officials, others that are really trying to decide the direction of organizations and governments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott Drum.
Good morning. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Josh Lehner. Josh is an economist with the State Economist's Office in Salem. Quoting directly from his bio, he is the de facto vice economist for the state of Oregon. As part of his responsibilities include forecasting revenue related to the Oregon Lottery, the Oregon Judicial Department, and the state's taxes on marijuana and tobacco. But I assure you, his expertise goes the span of the Oregon economy, and in fact, a large portion of what Josh's job responsibilities is to develop the state's quarterly economic outlook, including the outlook for employment, income, and housing. So today we have asked Josh to come and talk with us about his thoughts on the Oregon economy and specifically address some key risks and issues such as federal tax policy, international trade, and the disparity we have been experiencing here in the metro area in terms of income. His presentation is fairly high level, about 15 to 20 minutes, so there's time for you to ask questions of Josh. And then also at the end, he has a link to his blog that he maintains with really interesting analysis on different kinds of economic data and economic issues. So Josh, welcome and thank you for being with us today. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, members of the commission. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. As Scott said, our office, we do the economic and revenue forecasting for the state. We don't tell the legislature how to spend the money. We just make guesses of how much money they will have to spend. You're probably more familiar with our work as we are responsible for the Oregon personal income tax kicker. When our estimates are off, that's when you guys get a kicker check or a kicker credit on your taxes as you're filing this April. You'll have another one of those. So that's my fault. So today, I think the biggest issue is, particularly as you're doing your budget work, right? And we're starting to ramp up again on the next budget cycle at the state level, the 1921 biennium, to think about where we are at this point in the business cycle. What are the growth prospects in the short term versus the medium and the longer term? And they're quite different right now. Right now, the risk of recession remains fairly low. The economic flow of data, all the monthly data and leading indicators that we have are all still flashing green. We're not seeing any bad economic data out there right now. So the probability of recession in the near term is relatively low given the healthy economic data flow and federal fiscal policy. We're juicing the economy with deficit financed tax cuts and spending increases at the federal level to the magnitude of 1.5% of GDP. We're not going to get 1 or 1.5% extra growth in the economy due to these policies, but that's the relative size of it. And so again, the near-term growth prospects remain bright. The economy is still in expansion. However, the medium to longer term, absolutely, we need to start thinking more about the risk of recession. And right now, we're starting to coalesce around the possibility that we're going to overstimulate the economy in the near term. We're going to run the economy hot for a couple of years, maybe a year or two. Inflation will rise. The Federal Reserve will step in and raise interest rates maybe a little faster than they would be warranted, and that might choke off the recovery. To date, that seems to be the idea of where the potential for the next recession would come, barring some sort of catastrophic external event regarding natural disasters or nuclear war, crazy sort of scenarios like that. And so again, the difference here between the next year or two versus the next 5 years, the economic outlook's a bit different. First chart I brought today shows that we still remain in expansion. Maybe I didn't turn that on. Job growth is continuing. This is just showing Oregon versus the U.S. Oregon's the dark blue line. The U.S. is the light blue line. How many jobs have we added today relative to 12 months ago? You'll notice a couple things about this. First, we're more volatile than the U.S. The Oregon underlying economy is more volatile than the U.S. for two main reasons. We're still a manufacturing state. We produce more goods as a share of our GDP than most other states in the U.S. in goods-producing industries, including our natural resources, are more volatile over the business cycle, contributing to the boom-bust nature. The second one is our population growth. When jobs are available here in Oregon, particularly vis-a-vis our Western peers, we get a massive influx of people moving here during the good economic times, and that also contributes to our volatility over the entire business cycle. So again, we're on the upswing. We're still in expansion. Oregon's outperforming the typical state. We typically come out ahead over the entire business cycle because we spend many more years in expansion than we do in recession. But we're starting to slow down. You'll see that dark blue line has been tapering off for the last couple of years. The peak of the cycle was in 2015 in terms of the job growth and income growth and things like that, because that was when we were seeing a lot of job growth and we're putting all those unemployed people and underemployed people from the recession back to work. And now we're starting to run into some capacity constraints. First and chief among them would be labor. It's harder to find workers today because there's not that stockpile of unemployed people just waiting around for a job. But we're running into other capacity constraints from an infrastructure perspective, from a production capacity perspective. We're getting more office space, more warehouse space, more retail space, a little less on the retail side. And we need this extra space to grow and to accommodate economic growth and population growth moving forward. But it means that because we don't have a ton of empty warehouses today, it means you have to build whole new ones, and that's a little slower process and a multi-year process to bring those online. So we're starting to see growth slow as we bump up against some of these capacity constraints again, but we're still for a good reason, right? Again, most people have a job today, so slow down to something more sustainable over the medium term remains the outlook and is good news. We're slowing down for good news, for good reasons. Oh, can next slide, please? Thank you. And as the expansion has matured, we're seeing the growth spread out, and it's reaching all corners of the state. It's reaching all populations of the state, maybe unevenly. Here you can see this is job growth. It starts at 0 on the left before the recession, where employment peaked prior to the downturn. As you drop down, that's how many jobs were lost during the recession and its aftermath. And then as you work your way back up to the right, that's regaining all the jobs. And when you're above 0 again, that means you're now at a historical high, or historical all-time high in terms of jobs. And you can see first here in Portland, we had a traditional V-shaped recovery, a deep recession followed by a strong recovery. The rest of the state, a little different. We had the secondary metropolitan areas around the state were very hard hit by the housing downturn. Bend and Medford in particular were not just the epicenters of the housing bubble here in Oregon, they were also the epicenter of the housing bubble across the nation, every bit as bad as Las Vegas and Florida and Phoenix and those other places that you've heard about. So it took a couple years until the housing market started to clear out, job growth returned to construction, population flows returned in 2013, 2014 in particular, and we started to see these regional economies rebound. A couple years later, here come the rural communities. As the housing market cleared there, population growth returned, public sector budgets were repaired, public sector becomes a larger share in our rural communities, not because our rural communities love government workers, but because their private sectors are relatively smaller and less diverse and more dependent upon some specific industries, and agriculture being a good example of some of those. So again, more broad-based across populations, across regions, and more importantly, the feel-good nature of the business cycles here is translated into gains for household incomes for the typical workers. And in fact, if you look at the last few years, the strongest growth in household incomes are for those at the bottom of the income spectrum. Those down there in the 20, 30, $40,000 a year household income range are seeing the largest increases. Of course, they're not doing well. It's hard to make ends meet. They're struggling to meet rent and to put food on the table and all those sort of things. But they're starting to see that income growth after quite a long time, really the last 15, 20 years of not seeing any. We're finally starting to see some of it due to the strong economy. Again, these gains for households in the middle and bottom part of the income distribution are entirely reliant on a strong economy. The only source of income they have are wages. They don't have capital gains. They don't have rental properties. They don't have these other sort of investment related incomes that have done better over the last 10 or 20 years. So they're fully reliant on the labor market. And then, of course, if you're low enough, the public safety net. And so, again, as the strong economy has put more people back to work, wages are starting to rise. They're not rising at a particularly brisk rate. But here in Oregon, we're seeing better gains than what you see nationally. So, again, the transition and where we are in the business cycle has clearly shifted. The feel-good nature's here. It doesn't mean everybody's doing well, but they're at least doing better than they were certainly a few years ago. And as this expansion continues for another year or two, potentially will be better than maybe we were in the late 1990s. I don't think we're quite all the way there across a whole host of economic data, but we're on our way to getting to be to a pretty strong economy.
I got a question on the low-wage income growth. Can you separate out the impact of minimum wage versus income growth in the marketplace?
Commissioner Chamberlain, yes.
We increased the minimum wage, so that would impact specifically low-income folks. And what I'm trying to figure out is that had an impact, but was there a further impact of folks getting paid more because of labor shortages or whatever?
Sure. Exactly. Commissioner Chamberlain, I think it's a great question, and it's a hard thing to distinguish right now. The two things I will say about this, right now we know for the most part that the minimum wage is not what you would call a binding constraint on the labor market. As economists would say, it's not necessarily driving a lot of the income growth in the labor market today because of the tight labor market, right? You know, you go to the Oregon coast, and they have giant banners outside of the Taco Bell in Newport saying $12 an hour. I think it's a little higher than that now, right? Right, because it's hard to find workers in this relatively strong economy. So the wages are rising due to the labor market overall. That doesn't mean the minimum wage is not a help to these lower income workers. In particular, when the process started around the country, in a weaker economy, they were providing boosts. A lot of the academic research, some of the newer academic research is showing that these minimum wage increases are not, in the current economic environment at least, being a detriment to the overall economy, as maybe some of the historical economic literature would suggest, right? And so they're helping the workers. Maybe you're getting a little fewer hours, a little more hourly pay per worker, so your take-home pay isn't necessarily too different than it was before, but you're getting, more leisure time or more time with the family or things like that in some cases. So I'd say those two things are true. Whether or not, at this point in time you can say it's totally due to policy or not, that's a harder thing to distinguish, and I'll wait for some more academic research along those lines to fully vet that one out. Next slide, please. And again, as I said, it's all about the tight labor market. Here we're looking at the share of the prime working age population that has a job. Instead of looking at the unemployment rate or the labor force participation rate, let's just look at what share of people actually have a job. And this is 25 to 54-year-olds. These are people that, outside of staying at home to take care of the family or the kids or the grandparents or something like that, primarily people are in the workforce. And today, we're all the way back to where we were 10 years ago. We're still not quite back to the 1990s level of employment rates, but we're back to where we were prior to the downturn. So this means all the people that were unemployed, relatively speaking, now have a job, and we've accommodated that influx of people moving into the region. They have jobs as well. And so again, we have a little more room to run here before we really run into a labor shortage. But we're in a tight labor market, and this is what's driving most of those income gains, particularly for wage workers and at the lower end of the spectrum. It's harder to find workers, so we're getting them start to be bid up. Next slide, please.
Quick question,
yes,
if I
please.
could go back to that one. Is this data disaggregated across cultural groups? I mean, when you begin to look at employment levels, particularly 25 to 54, even the lower end of that spectrum, this huge variation in terms of employment or unemployment rates. Do you track that across cultural groups?
The data is available across cultural groups. I did not bring that with me today, Commissioner Alexander. We do know there are massive racial disparities. When it comes to the household income growth, those are reaching all communities, but the disparities remain. And I'll have something on East Portland, numbers here towards the end, but when it comes to things like the poverty rate here in the metropolitan area, right? The poverty rate here in the Portland region is basically or exactly twice as high for our communities of color than it is for our white non-Hispanic households. And that gap, thank you, that gap has remained consistent over the entire business cycle. It's not necessarily getting worse, but it's not getting better at the same time. And again, a racial gap of twice the poverty rate is really massive. And if you disaggregate that further, we know that, you know, Asian households have a lower poverty rate. Our Black households have a significantly higher poverty rate. So within that, there's a lot of variation as well.
Yeah, I know that historically that's been true. I'm very interested in whether the rate of recovery over the last 10 years has mimicked the prior sort of disparity, or whether there have been some gains, even though there's some gaps.
Yes, Commissioner Alexander, along those lines, at least at a very high level, the recovery has been proportionate. So again, that those disparities remain. They're not getting better, but they're not getting worse, at least in the Portland metropolitan area. So it's you know, it's not the worst case scenario, but it's not the best scenario either. Nope. Now it's my turn to mess it up. So from this relatively strong vantage point of the economy to date, right, what's going to happen? What is the near-term outlook? The biggest thing that's changed in the last 6 months is federal fiscal policy. Here, we're just looking at a literature review of some of the studies that have been done on the tax cuts at the federal level. Again, this is deficit finance spending. It will juice the economy in the short run. Over the medium to longer term, not as much growth potential for a number of reasons. The way the tax cuts are designed, tailored towards higher income households and corporations for the most part, we know they will save some of their tax savings. They will save it and not necessarily spend it, so you get a little less bang for your buck. A big one is the temporary provisions. You know, in 2020, 2021, a lot of these things start unwinding due to some of their inflation adjustments, and by 2025, a lot of the personal provisions are gone entirely, and it's actually a tax increase on a lot of households. So the design of the cuts, the temporary nature of the cuts, the point in the cycle we're at a relatively strong point. You get less bang for your buck from tax cuts and federal spending when the economy is already strong. Typically, you want to run counter-cyclical fiscal policy, where we know we have underutilized resources and unemployed workers when the unemployment's really high. Today, we're more maybe potentially concerned about crowding out, where the government spending just kind of displaces some private sector spending. We know that doesn't happen during a recession, but maybe in a strong economy, that's a bigger deal. And the fourth reason for why you get less bang for your buck will be the Federal Reserve response. Again, strong economy, inflation starting to pick up potentially a little bit. Maybe this juicing the economy will raise inflation a little bit more. Federal Reserve could step in and raise interest rates faster to unwind some of this growth. So you put this all together and you get less bang for your buck given those reasons than maybe you would have at a different point in the cycle or a different set of policy proposals. But that said, all these numbers you see here are still positive, right? I don't think there's a single negative number up there. That'd be the one thing you'd look to. So the long run potential will be raised just a hair based on some of these policies. The last thing I'll say about this is that bottom set when it comes to the corporations. The economic literature is very clear when we talk about corporate taxes versus worker wages. The way this relationship historically works and the way the literature is written is that corporations get a tax cut, or they have lower after-tax incomes or higher after-tax incomes, and they invest that in plants and equipment, and their workers become more productive, and a more productive worker gets higher wages as a result. It's a multi-year process. Corporations don't get a tax cut today and turn around tomorrow and hand a bonus check to their workers, as the way it's maybe been played out in the media and some press releases in recent months. That's not the way this relationship works. And this isn't just me saying this. This is specifically the case laid out by the Trump administration's Council of Economic Advisors in the fall of 2016 or the fall of 2017 when they put out a white paper on corporate taxation, right? This is the way it results. And so this idea that we're going to cut corporate taxes and we're going to get higher paychecks is absolutely borne out in the academic literature. It's just a multi-year process. And so therefore the bonuses and the press releases we've seen in recent months are probably more about the tight labor market and people getting increases due to the fact that it's harder to find and retain workers today than it was a few years ago. I probably shouldn't be allowed to touch this. I apologize. Thank you. There we go. outlook, growth continues. That's the big story. It's slower than it has been. We've already started to taper off our job growth here in Oregon. Over the next couple of years, we'll maintain these relatively lower rates, just a little bit above potential due to the increased in economic activity from federal fiscal policy, a little bit faster than what we'll need to keep up with population growth moving forward. And then in 2020, 2021, that's really where some of this fiscal stimulus juice runs out, and our demographics really weigh on these longer term growth rates. It's not that demographics are a problem necessarily, but it's going to result in slower growth moving forward as the baby boomers continue to retire. If you think about it, if a baby boomer retires, you have to hire two people to get job growth, right? The first person just replaces them, and that's a zero gain in economic growth or job growth or things like that. And so to get these net increases, we have to hire more than the retirees are flowing out the back end of the labor market. And so that's the biggest reason why we'll see slower growth over time. And then the federal fiscal policy alters that behavior in the near term for the next couple of years. A couple issues and risk along these lines. The biggest one I talk about, particularly here at the port, would be international trade. This is something that's been a boon to the Oregon and Pacific Northwest economy over time. Our increased trade relations with Pacific Rim countries, Canada and China being our most important trading partners, our largest trading partners. This, again, has been a tailwind to economic growth historically, but potentially will turn into a headwind given recent tweets and policy announcements and things like that. And so the concern is how much of a hit to date are we talking about? And to help frame the discussion to some degree, obviously we trade a lot with China. We're talking $3, $4, $5 billion of Oregon exports going to China on a yearly basis in recent years. A good chunk of that we know are high-tech exports, where firms are shipping things they make in Washington County to their assembly plants around the world. So intermediate goods transferred within firms isn't exactly a true international export where you're selling it to foreign buyers, but that shows up in the data. So that's a good chunk of it. But we go down to some of these industries that are tariff impacted, at least based on the current lists that are available. We're still talking $400-500 million average for Oregon exports going to China for the last 5 or 6 years, these sort of industries. And that's a big number, but that's not a big enough number to fully derail the regional economy. These things actually get impacted. Here we're talking, 0.2% of state GDP in relative size. These things won't go to zero overnight. A higher tariff will mean final prices to Chinese consumers are higher, so they'll buy less American or less Oregon-made products, but they're not going to go to zero, so the full impact will be significantly less. That doesn't mean they're not going to be losers. Farmers, wheat, some of our nuts and our berries and things like that are on the list. The aluminum scrap exports that we're doing, those are things that will be severely impacted by these should they come to fruition. To date, they've just been announced. But again, the issue of bilateral trade, where it's just the U.S. versus China or just U.S. versus Mexico, that's less of a concern from a macroeconomic perspective than if we get something much broader than that, where this tit-for-tat escalation really rises to a trade war where there's multiple countries involved. Then what will happen is we'll really muck up the global supply chains. That's the biggest thing we're concerned about. Again, is not just reduced exports to China or to Mexico. It's about if we get reduced exports to everyone, then the fact that we have a global supply chain for all of our industries means something will get mucked up and everybody will be a little bit worse off due to that. So again, we're not to there yet. We're still in the saber rattling mode. Maybe we're up to a skirmish, that escalation, we're not there yet. The concern is that potentially we're on that road. Another risk would be population growth. The Oregon economy in the Northwest, the number one thing that we do, our number one comparative advantage, is our ability to attract young, working age, skilled households. And when they move here, they don't move again, and we have them for the rest of their working career. So we get this influx of young, skilled labor over time, and it's a boon to our local firms because they're able to attract workers and retain workers much better than some other places in the country where they're worried about brain drain and things like that. So something that puts our population growth at risk will certainly alter our long-term growth prospects as well. Whether that's a downturn, people don't move as much during a recession comes, our migration flows will dry up because people hunker down during recessions. Also, something like affordability is a big risk here, because if people can't afford to move to the region, then our population growth will be significantly slower and our long-term growth prospects will be worse off because affordability puts that at risk. You layer that with something like what's going on in the labor market with job polarization, where job growth is increasingly concentrated in the last 20 years in high wage occupations, which are generally college educated workers, doctors, attorneys, office workers, consultants, engineers, computer scientists, that sort of stuff, and low wage occupations, food preparation, building maintenance crews, and things along those nature. That's where a lot of the job growth, particularly in the last 20 years, has been focused. Middle wage jobs, construction workers, teachers, police workers, office support staff, manufacturing, things like that have been relatively flat for 20 years. They've gone up and down with the business cycle, but there's been no growth even in Portland over the last 20 years. And they've certainly been down in a lot of places that aren't Portland, that haven't seen the economic growth we have here. And this is primarily due to technological change. Some of it's population driven. We have more people. We need more construction workers and more teachers and things like that. But it's also due to technological change and automation. No modern office today looks like Mad Men television show where you have an administrative assistant outside of every single office around the floor, right? That doesn't exist today anymore, let alone we don't have switchboard operators and typists and things like that. So we've eliminated a lot of positions, not just in manufacturing, but in classically office type work as well over the last couple of generations. And this weighs on these middle wage jobs tremendously, this technological change. And that's not expected to lessen moving forward. So again, this shift, this polarization in the labor market is massive, has massive implications. So when you layer on affordability problems and displacement with labor market outcomes that are polarized, you start to get disparities that are entrenched within regions, right? Here we're looking at household income. On the west side of Portland, this is the Willamette River to Beaverton to the west, and to Lake Oswego to the south. So all of downtown Pearl District, the West Hills on down through all those southwest communities down towards Lake Oswego. And that's the top line. The bottom line is East Portland. That includes here in the port, the facilities here at the port, and then basically 82nd over to Gresham to the east. That's basically how these census tracts are lined up in the Portland metropolitan area. And you can see we've seen growth in the overall metropolitan area. We've seen growth certainly in the West Hills and their income gains, and the west side of Portland more broadly. But we've seen less on our eastern communities. East County has not seen the growth as well. And so this has to do with the sorting of households within the region as they're displaced from, some of our central neighborhoods more historically, as they're pushed further east to find more affordable housing. Not necessarily affordable housing, but it's more affordable than those rents in the inner city versus those labor market outcomes where basically if you don't have a college degree, the prospects of finding one of those high wage jobs are significantly reduced. And you start to see this. And one of the issues here with the displacement and this, the uneven disparities within a region is something like residential segregation from an economic income perspective and from a racial integration perspective is something that's highly determinant on overall economic mobility. The academic research literature, one of the 5 criterias, I'm spacing on all of the other ones off the top of my head, for regions that have high economic mobility, which means a kid that's born into a low income household has the prospects of becoming a higher income household in adulthood. One of the key characteristics of communities that have high economic mobility is better residential integration. And this again is both from an economic perspective, having households of multiple income strata within the same community, and from a racial perspective. And so again, to the fact that our segregation is increasing in the region means that likely is to lead to less economic mobility over time. With that being said, I should point out that we think things are bad here in Portland, but residential integration in the Portland region is significantly better than the vast majority of other large metropolitan areas around the country. Particularly if you look at the South and the Midwest, they've seen significantly more segregation than we have. But that says ours isn't getting better at the same time. So just wanted to bring that to the attention of the group and some of the different impacts that are along there. Bottom line, economic growth is continuing over the near term, the next year, maybe the next 2 years. Our office is much more concerned about upside risk than we are downside, that the economic growth over the next 12, 18 months will be better than we're expecting. And then, of course, given we're the kicker office, that growth comes to fruition and it is better than expected. That likely means another kicker check or kicker credit in the future. Over the medium term, I think those recessionary risks are starting to mount a little bit. We can start to focus on maybe what a plausible recession scenario looks like. We're not there yet. The Federal Reserve is data dependent. They will adjust their policy accordingly. At least they say they will. We hope so. And so that is, we kind of have that dichotomy of the short term versus the medium term risk to the outlook. I appreciate your time. If there's time for questions, I'd be happy to answer any. Here's my contact information. If general economic news or information or outlook is ever of interest to you and you wish to discuss it, please give me a call. Send me an email. Always happy to chat and answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a lot of important information, and we appreciate you bringing it as we are moving into budget season here as well.
Can I just ask one question? If we go back to the first slide, I think it's the first one. Yeah. So is there significance to you? And it looks to me like the peaks are lower by and large, and the dips are greater on that chart over time.
Yes, Commissioner Carter, the peaks are lower due to the demographics, right? In the 60s and 70s, which you don't see here, but they're even higher, we had the entrance of women and minorities into the labor force, which we hadn't seen historically, at least in the paid labor force. And so overall demographics and population growth, plus the shifting of who works, went up tremendously. In the 80s and the 90s, we started to get those participation rates play out as the baby boomers were fully into their prime working years. And now in the 2000s and 2010s and 2020s, the baby boomers are starting to retire, right? So that's the reason for the peak rates are getting less and less over time, because the participation rates playing out, and actually participation rates going down as we're retiring more. The downsides is very, they do look like they're getting worse, right? The 90s, 2000s, Great Recession. The recession, I wouldn't say that that's the pattern, or that should be the expectations moving forward. The issues with the downside is the very specific nature of the downturn itself. In the 1990s, we had high inflation, we had a lot of things. We had a housing bubble in Southern California, we had the wind down of the Cold War, we had all these sort of things that played out that tipped the U.S. into recession. It was a relatively mild one. It was especially mild here in Oregon because we don't have a defense industry and things like that. I would say the 2001 recession is an extra special case because it was a tech downturn. And what gets hit the hardest during downturn is manufacturing, and high-tech manufacturing is our specialty. We don't have software. Our software is growing, but it's not nearly what it is in the Bay Area or in Seattle, which had milder 2001 recessions than we did. Even though they're tech concentrated like we are, it's the nature of that tech that was hit so hard. And so being a tech manufacturing center is the reason why we were more severe in 2001 than the typical area. The Great Recession, that was an equal opportunity disaster. And again, we had a housing bubble that was worse here than a lot of other places, and just the more boom bust of our manufacturing sector. So moving forward, I think the risk, I think it would be reasonable to expect that we'll fall further in the recession than the typical place. But I don't think at this point in time, it's more likely to be like the 1990, 1991 recession than it is the other two, unless we get a very specific event in recession cause. But that would be a quick history of some of those issues. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
Josh, I wonder, Madam Chair, if I might ask a question. When I was in the governor's office and we had these conversations about your guys' forecasts, it was always a few really big questions, and a lot of them are in this data. I wonder if you just share your own thinking about Intel in particular and our regional state dependence on, you just described it as this technical, it's this R&D, 20,000 or so immediate jobs, but a much broader impact. And I just wonder, from your guys' seat in Salem, how do you think about that? How do you think about Intel and its future as an employer and the impacts it has on us regionally?
Sure. Thanks, Curtis. I didn't highlight it at the front, but on the opening slide, there's a disclaimer in the corner that says the views expressed here are my own. Even though we're in the executive branch and we're friends with Governor Brown, well, she did not send me here this morning to discuss. On a personal level, and as looking at the economic data, there's no question that Intel's a vital cog of the region. They drive so much of our wage growth and our income growth and our job growth and our exports and our productivity numbers. When you look at state GDP, Oregon always is a top performer on state GDP, because what they do out there is they take raw ingredients and they make silicon wafers, which are in semiconductors, right? You're starting from nothing and you're making something that's worth hundreds of dollars on it, but millions of dollars on the scale that they do it, even billions of dollars. And so the productivity growth that comes out of Washington County, Intel being by far the largest component, is huge when it comes to the economic numbers. That said, we talked about high-tech manufacturing is no longer a job growth industry in Oregon. It's been down since the 2001 tech recession, and we haven't seen a ton of growth. There's been some ups and downs, and Intel has added jobs. There's no question that Intel specifically has added thousands of jobs over the last 20 years. It's just that the rest of that cluster of our hard-tech hardware manufacturers has shrunk, right? They've lost thousands of jobs. So Intel's added thousands of jobs. Everyone else from, Lattice and FEI and some of those other historical Tektronix being the previous anchor before Intel, they have all shrunk their employment and their operations over time as technology has changed. So the employment has been relatively steady in the last 10 to 15 years. It's less than it was in the 90s, but it's been steady for the last 10 to 15 years. Our office's forecast for hardware manufacturing, high-tech hardware manufacturing, is actually for slight declines over the coming years. Not a ton of losses, but not growth, and just a slight expectation of ongoing automation and operation consolidation and things like that. So that's kind of the two things. It's a big, vital, important part of the Oregon economy and the Portland metropolitan economy. That said, the growth is coming from the income and the productivity, and less the actual number of people that are employed there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Yeah,
Appreciate
thanks.
it. Thank you.
Thank you. Great stuff.
He's not too small.
We have one consent item today. I'm wondering if the commissioner needs a presentation on the consent item. Okay. The consent item is the Port of Portland grant application for Metro Urban Growth Boundary Employment Land Site Readiness Toolkit. And I'd like to call for a motion and second for approval of the consent item. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. First action item, Vince, if you could come present. Thank you.
Good morning. As Curtis said in his executive director report, we've got a couple of items here related to the PDX Next program. This first one here is for an amendment for ZGF, but I'll just talk about this. And this is more of a graphical representation of some of Curtis's remarks about what we've been doing on the 5 big projects, the quick turnaround facility,
Excuse me, Vince.
there on the north. We're moving through those very quickly. We're getting to design on the parking addition, the Packer project, as we call it. So this morning, the first project that we've got is an amendment for the terminal core for the ZGF contract, and this is part of the Concourse A and B remodel. This will be the first part of the program. They need to get into the big part of the terminal core itself. So the first piece that we've got here for George is the ZGF contract, and then related to that, the next item that Eric will do will be related to the rental car center as part of the Packer project. So I'll turn it over to George now for just this for this particular item.
Thank you, Vince. So the overall terminal core project, if you remember, commissioners, will build about 180 feet to the west of the existing food court. That's the western expansion. We'll relocate security back into the western expansion, take the concession nodes that are today after post-security, and they'll also move back into the western expansion at the intersection of the western expansion and Concourse C and D. We'll also take ticketing, rotate it 90 degrees, and then have a very intuitive wayfinding for the passengers from ticketing to security and to their gates. Last November, the airlines approved phase 1 of the project, which was the western expansion, as well as Concourse B. Also approved the design of the entire project, as well as the installation and construction of the roof over the entire terminal area. After the completion of the schematic design, the end of this year, we'll develop the plan around when to go back to airlines and how to go back to airlines to get approval for the remainder of the project. So as you see the rest of the presentation, it'll be a phase 1, phase 2, but our intent is to get the entire project approved. So TCOR has a couple of major projects besides the renovation of the main terminal. The first is Concourse A and B remodel. This project will enable us to relocate the ground load functions that are occurring at Concourse A into an expansion of Concourse B. At the completion of that, Concourse A will be demolished and the ramp will be repaved and will be built for remain overnight parking. Here's a graphic representation of the conceptual plan of the extension of Concourse B that goes off here at an angle. We're intending on putting 6 ground load gates into Concourse B, which will replace Concourse A. Concourse A is shown down here in the bottom right as a shadow, as a red shadow. One of our desires of bringing the construction manager, general contractor on board early for this project, as you can imagine, is the construction phasing of having to keep Concourse A up and running while we construct Concourse B, and passengers have to go through B to get to A. So we've got to really figure out that coordination activity. Here's a depiction of the Packer Rental Car Center. In the red over there on the side is the area that's the customer service building and the rental car center. This is the second major portion of the project that TCOR is also funding. We're having to extend the rental car center by 3 floors. Because the TCOR project is removing the mezzanine out of the terminal building. So there's functions sitting on top of the mezzanine, including the comm center, Port Police, TSA, the badging office, that have to have a new home to go to. Our desire is to move them to one place rather than have to locate them somewhere else and then temporarily bring them back in the building, especially some of the functions like the comm center that are so dependent upon IT functions. It'd be very difficult and costly to move twice. So the intent is to build this space. This is a TCOR funded project. The Packer project with J.E. Dunn will actually do the implementation, and Eric will follow this presentation with his plan for his agenda item for amending their contract to do the design of this space. So overall scope, our plan here is to improve the seismic resiliency of the terminal building. We'll be removing Concourse A, which is clearly an old and antiquated facility with a new structure. Concourse B will be removing the most vulnerable portions of the terminal building with the roof and replacing them with a new roof, as well as constructing the western expansion to be a more seismically resilient facility than the rest of the terminal. We'll increase the capacity and flexibility to security checkpoints by relocating those back to the western expansion. Today, the security checkpoints are very geographically constrained, be difficult to expand. This gives us the opportunity to set up the flexibility as security needs change over the time, as well as increasing our flexibility for passenger processing. We'll be constructing about 250,000 square feet with the western expansion, and at the end, we'll be using the same energy we're using today for the existing terminal buildings. So we'll be able to increase the energy, the environmental efficiency on our complex. By bringing the CMGC on board early, we have an opportunity to provide for a strong equity and diversity program long before the construction actually kicks off on the project. And this will definitely increase our customer experience, especially around Concourse A, by demolishing A and improving all of those regional flight passenger experience. So we've been here a couple times before for commission approvals on the ZGF contract as well as the Turner contract. Our expectation, as Curtis mentioned earlier, was to be back next month with the CMG, the construction manager, general contractor contract. We'll also be here towards the end of the year with an amendment for ZGF's contract for final design development, as well as the hopefully established construction price for the Concourse B work. And then next year, be back for the overall project construction price. Design will be proceeding through 2020. The CMGC pre-construction services will go through about middle of 2019. Construction should begin the end of this year with some of the Concourse B renovations. The major portion of Concourse B with the extension of the contract or the concourse itself should kick off towards the end of 2019, go through the middle of 2020, and then Concourse A will be demolished towards the end of 2020. The main portion of the western expansion should kick off around the 1st of 2020, take about 3.5 years to do that construction, and then phase 2 will take us to about a 5-year or so construction project overall, and there'll be some overlap between phase 2 and the western expansion construction. Today we're asking for about a $7 million increase in the ZGF contract. This was a planned contract amendment. When we requested commission approval in December, we completed conceptual design on the project, and we asked for approval for the ZGF contract for schematic design development for the major portion of the project. For Concourse B, we hadn't done conceptual design yet. This was a relatively late addition to the project. So we've recently completed the conceptual design. We're now planning on the entire design activity for Concourse B. So this overall project is, or right now their contract will be about $53 million. And it's something that we take a look at, make sure it's the right number compared to our overall construction cost of work, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that. So as I mentioned, phase 1 project is about $950 million. The overall project budget is currently scheduled about 1.4, but we will be developing 1.4 billion, but we'll be developing that at the end of schematic design and try to drive that down. Our small business participation rate for the design project is 10.3%. Right now we're trending at about 6%, but that's because of the type and nature of work we've done to date. As we kick off the detailed design, the small business enterprises will start picking up and drive that rate up to about 10%. Actually, this amendment today has about a 12.5% small business participation rate. So staff recommends approval of the executive director recommendation. Any questions?
Go ahead.
So a couple questions, George.
Jim,
Obviously, it's a big project. So first is 3 or 4 years from now, people sitting on this commission will be different people in many cases. And they're going to be looking at numbers that have continued to grow, I assume, because it's a long-term project and costs change and whatever. What are you going to be able to tell them when they ask, George, what have you done? What's the data that makes us feel comfortable that we have control of costs here, and that they relate or they're consistent with the costs of other similar large projects at other airports? So it's just a question about what's going to comfort those people and their ability to tell the public that this has been a managed project consistent with other things in the country.
Yeah. So a couple things we have done to date. We brought Turner Construction on board with a national experience on doing airport terminals, and they have level set us to look at a number of terminals that they have done, and we were right in the middle of the dollars per square foot costing they are. But that's not really sufficient. I mean, it's just because other airports have done certain dollars doesn't mean we want to be at the same number. So one of our desires is by bringing the Hoffman-Skanska team on board, our CMGC, early in the process, we can be working together to make sure we have the right construction cost. Our goal is not to over design it or overbuild it, but controlling cost all the way through. So you're seeing the numbers we're projecting at potentially 1.4 billion. Our desire is not to spend 1.4 billion or above that. Our desire is going forward, we're driving the cost down, not up. So hopefully future commissioners aren't having to see prices higher than what we're showing you guys today.
And I guess I'd also say the airlines have asked a similar question. And so we've shown them a lot of that same information. We also only have approval to spend the $950 million. So right now, that's what our focus is to try to spend and get to that dollar. Anything that'll go above and be, if it had to go, it would be only with the airline's approval, right? It's not going to go any higher than that. So it's got to be well justified if it gets to that point. But we have been, right, the full project was designed at around the 1.4 billion. We've been trying to see what can we actually get this thing done at the 950 that they gave us. So that's our intent. But again, we'll be doing the things that George mentioned as well from a technical side to manage the cost.
Okay.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Just quick question. When you publicly say a contingency of 20% of total is reasonable,
Mhm.
I have no idea, that means a potential overrun cost will be up to 22% of this and that. What factors that go into determination of what is reasonable, what is not? I'm a lay person. Would you just run that thing? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the biggest thing is the amount of risk in the project. So it's laid out for where you stand with the design. And a project like this, you think about we're demoing the terminal building and rebuilding the terminal building. So there's a lot of risk into construction difficulty, construction phasing difficulty we haven't really fully anticipated yet. So if you think about the design aspect, what we try to do is starting early in a project, anywhere from 20 to 25% design. And as you just get further along in the design process, you'll have more knowledge of what you're dealing with. So as you drive that design to its completion, your contingency number would come down. We're showing you this, and we're still only at 12% design. So that's why it's still a reasonable number at this point. Yeah, it's a big number because it's a big project, but as a percentage, it's not really large compared. Now, if we had a competitively bid number as we get further along and we develop the guaranteed maximum price with the construction manager, then our contingency level will come down because our risk level will come down. Did I answer your question?
More or less.
Okay.
I kind of look at it as how much is unknown.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of
how big could the surprise be?
Yeah. And
The more you know, the more you narrow it down. That's different. So
Yep.
This is also, within the engineering profession, there are standards and principles that we follow. This is very consistent with those that, in fact, in the beginning, a lot of times you might see on a project a 40% contingency because you know very little. But as you move along in the project, you're steadily reviewing where you're at, what your risks are at that time, and adjusting your contingency. And how we deliver projects, we go through stage gate reviews at various times. Engineering, along with our sponsors of the projects and along with the portfolio office, at which point at each one of those gates, we actually review that level of contingency to see if it is adequate enough, or we actually give money back at those times if we believe that we're not going to require the amount of contingency that's still remaining. So it's a very structured and controlled process.
Because I'm not an engineer. Mm-hmm.
So as an example, a roadway paving project might start, it's a $4 million project. It might start with a 10% contingency. So I have a much smaller because of the scale and complexity being so tight.
Right.
You'd start at a much smaller contingency number.
Yes.
Thank you. Before I call for a motion and second, I'd like to recognize Commissioner McDonald, who's on the phone.
Thank you. As my sister-in-law is an employee of ZGF, I have an interest in any action that affects ZGF. Therefore, I am declaring an actual conflict of interest. I have not participated in the discussion, and I will not participate on this agenda item in terms of voting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments before I call for motion? So I call for a motion on the executive director's recommendation.
So moved. Second.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Vince, you've got our second item as well.
So this is a follow-on to the first item that we just talked about. And so part of what was discussed, there are a number of operations in the existing terminal building in the mezzanine area that we are moving out. And so we are going to put them on top of what we're calling the RCC, the Rental Car Center. It'll be a great opportunity for us to consolidate these operations. This is being done at other airports across the country. We know LA has done this, DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth. And so it'll be a great opportunity for us to get TSA, the police, their comm center, our communications center, all into one fully resilient building. In order to do that, the best place to do it, we found, is in the top part of this rental car center, which is being constructed by our friends at J.E. Dunn. So Eric is here to request an amendment to their contract to have them construct the project out of funding from the Terminal Core project.
Thank you, Vince. Good morning, everyone. Having a little trouble with the slides.
Yeah, this is not our...
It's the next one.
No, this is... No, wrong presentation. This is for... We're on the Packer, not the Terminal Core. There you go.
Yeah. There we are.
No.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. Today I'd like to request approval of an amendment to a public improvement contract to J.E. Dunn Construction Company for final design services at the rental car center. What we and Vince has mentioned about the RCC, Portland International Airport, in the amount of about $2.3 million. So this is the same rendering that George showed in his presentation. The outline in red is what we're talking about here today. This amendment is for final design services for the J.E. Dunn design build team to design the core and shell of this building, which is coordinated with the T-Core design team, who is doing the interior work as far as design is concerned. As shown up here is the schedule for the J.E. Dunn work. The red diamond shows commission action for today. I'll be coming back. It's anticipated to be in September of this year for a GMP amount for both the construction work of the RCC core and shell, as well as the rest of the Packer project. We intend to seek GMP approval for all of that work in one item at the end of this summer after the GMP process. Budget is shown here for the T-Core project, since this amendment is being funded out of the T-Core project entirely. Design MWESB participation goal is 10%. We are currently targeting at about 10.7% for the J.E. Dunn project for design phase services. We have another goal for construction. And funding for this work is through the Airline Cost Center. Staff requests approval of the Executive Director's recommendation.
Any comments or questions, Commissioners? Okay, hearing none, I'll call for a motion and second on the Executive Director's recommendation.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vince, if you could introduce our final item.
Yep, last one here is for another paving project on a much smaller scale. This is AirTrans Way on the south side of the airport. It leads into the cargo area. This was built back in the mid 80s and early 90s, and it's time to upgrade the pavement there, and Marcel's here for that.
Yeah, thanks and good morning. As Vince mentioned, I'm here to request your approval for a roadway improvement project. The project area shown on this slide, it's on the south side of PDX, just west of the Air National Guard base, and access is off Northeast Cornfoot Road. So most roads in this area are at the end of their technical life, and they are visibly starting to deteriorate. So therefore the port decided to repair and replace the pavement. As part of that, we will also be replacing sidewalks in areas where those are damaged, and some ADA ramps, wheelchair ramps. In addition to that, we will also be improving stormwater treatment for the area, which includes a construction of a new stormwater treatment vault, which has some excess capacity beyond what's needed for this project to facilitate stormwater treatment of the area for future development. So a schedule is shown here. Assuming your approval today, construction would start this summer and expected to be wrapped up in October, November of this year. The contract is part of a $5 million overall project budget. The small business goal for the project was set at 16%. The low bid lists a participation level of 18%. So with that, I'm requesting your approval to award contract for this project.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? So I'll call for a motion in second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Thank you, and we'll call the meeting adjourned.